Welcome back, everybody. This is the second installment in the series, and I'm titling this one, Eating as Nature's Currency. So I'm not aware of anyone else using this phrase, so after I've explained it, I do hope that it's a useful concept, and that it'll help get across a little bit of how we approach what we do, and by understanding a little bit more of how nature works. Last podcast, we contrasted the two paradigms, one of extraction versus the sustainable and regenerative agriculture. And I find it useful in order to explain what you're going after, it's often useful to critique what you're not. And the critique of the last podcast was of the industrial modern huge agriculture of the day. This podcast, I'll probably get myself in trouble, but it's going to be somewhat of a critique of the thought process that goes into vegetarianism or veganism. Before I really get going here, I wanted to read a quote from Michael Pollan to sort of set the tone of what I want to get across. And if I remember right, this is from The Omnivore's Dilemma. He writes, "We've been telling ourselves such stories of man and nature forever as a way of making sense of what we call our quote-unquote relationship to nature. To borrow that curious, revealing phrase, what other species can be said to have a relationship with nature? For a long time now, the man in these stories has gazed at nature across a gulf of awe or mystery or shame. Even when the tenor of these narratives changes, as it has over time, the gulf remains. There's the old heroic story where man is at war with nature, the romantic version where man merges spiritually with nature, usually with some help from the pathetic fallacy, and more recently, the environmental morality tale in which nature pays man back for his transgressions, usually in the coin of disaster. 3 different narratives, at least, yet all of them share a premise we know to be false, but can't seem to shake, that we somehow stand outside or apart from nature." So getting back to the phrase, eating as nature's currency, I first came up with this when I was writing an essay it was a contest, and it was based on the question of, is eating meat ethical? And this was asking whether eating any meat, so eating meat in and of itself, whether it was ethical. And when I first approached it, it hit me as very absurd. And it was the fact that we would even ask this question made me try to think about what frame of mind do we have to be to even ask this question. And that was because everything we know about nature is that everything is constantly eating everything. And so it really came, I think that was the time when it really impressed upon me, like, how schizophrenic we really are, what sort of posture we have towards nature that we could even frame a question like that. And so I was trying to get at the fact that when you look at nature, the advent of a species that ate another one, so like in the case of, let's say, an herbivore eating a plant, this was not just a benefit for the herbivore. This was actually, when the herbivores came on the scene, it was another system, and it was a system that would eat the plants. But in having this feedback loop and returning the manure and returning the bacteria and enriching the soil, there was an explosion of the plants. And so that having a system above you that was consuming your part of your own system was actually very beneficial to that lower system. And so this concept of currency was, in a sense, trying to capture the idea of like an investment. So if you as a plant, or as the plant world, obviously not the individual plant, well, even for the individual plant, but I'm thinking more along of that kingdom or that group, to give part of yourself as an investment, send it through a system that can take it and bring back this whole feed loop, and that, the return on that is tenfold. And I think that's because nature is about diversity, and not necessarily diversity of species. I mean, that's part of it, but really what's going on is that each species is a system. So this is a diversity of systems, because in each case you have these feedback loops. And so if eating is the currency, then these feedback loops are happening on all sorts of different levels. So you have whether it's an herbivore eating the plants, or if it's a predator, a carnivore eating the herbivore, or the bacteria inside the gut of all these, right? I mean, we think of it as a hierarchy and that there's a food chain and everything, but it's a lot more complex than going up the food chain or down, because it doesn't matter if you're consuming it by tongue and teeth and ripping it with your carnivorous, jaws, or if you're a bacteria that's just absorbing it at the very micro nutrient level. It's all about consumption, and all these feedback loops are happening even within systems. So it's systems within systems that are affecting systems that then the output comes out and affects all the different levels and all the different layers. And we only got a real understanding of this when we saw the lack of what they call keystone species. So I'm thinking particularly of the wolves and the ungulate, probably the best known one. I think there's plenty of others, but this one's very relevant to what I do and what's going on. And so simply put, it was, I think, Yellowstone, or maybe some other parks, but they had this, they wanted to get the wolf population back in, and part of that reasoning was they thought, well, we need to get the ungulate population under control. And what they expected, that sort of direct relationship, but what they had not anticipated and only understood in hindsight was that in reestablishing the wolf, that the riparian systems, or the systems that are in and around the river, spring back to life. And this wasn't just an issue of population control. It was an issue of more interrelatedness, and there was a behavior modification. So to spell it out, you've got these ungulates, which are herbivores and ruminants, but they're very different from the buffalo or zebra or wildebeest that we talked about, that roamed and went in packs, and they moved and they ate and moved on. The pressure for them to move on was a predator pressure. So typically, you hang around. You hang around the rivers, you hang around where the water is plentiful, and that's great because you can just get water whenever you want, and then you end up staying around that area too much. There wasn't the pressure to move them on, and so they ended up eating down the vegetation too much, which there's complex stages of growth around riparian health. So you have brush-like bushes right across that help keep from erosion, and then it moves on to stages of trees, and you have this whole ecosystem. It provides habitat for frogs, for insects, for salamanders, newts, fish, birds, an entire ecosystem that just comes and springs back to life when the vegetation is allowed to not be eaten down too much. And so what's going on with a predator, and this is true whether you are a human or a lion or a wolf, but you go to the waters, whether and this because everyone's got to go drink, so you know that at some point some prey is going to show up there. And so the deer relearned that these weren't places to socialize. This is not where you hung out, and consequently ate all the vegetation down, but that you got your water and then you moved on. And what the surprise of reintroducing the wolf was that here was what they call keystone species, because they seem to have such a fundamental effect on all the stages of the ecosystem there. And so when the rivers spring back to life, it was because there was an important interconnection that had been missing. And so in chasing the deer and in putting this pressure, obviously it gets more complicated than just eating, but at least you get the sense that there would not be at least not even a moral question of whether the wolf should ever eat meat or not. It just simply, that's how things had evolved, and that's how things stay healthy. The point that I want to get across is that schizophrenic or not, we eat, and in so doing, we're participating in one system or another. And that's basically, if that's nature's currency, it's another way of saying that eating is our primary mode of interacting with her systems. And so it's very clear that I would argue against wanting to interact and to be eating with the extraction models. The drawbacks of that are very obvious. But I did say at the beginning that I was going to be somewhat a critique of vegetarianism, and it has to be broken down a little bit more. And the point there is that it's very difficult. We did not evolve in such a way as to easily get all our nutrients that we need through vegetarianism. And so it can be done, but it can't be done by participating in only local, at least not here, in only local systems. In order to get all the fatty acids, in order to get all your amino acids, in order to get all your nutrients that you need, when not getting them through meat, you end up having to get all sorts of extra stuff that are not going to be local, whether it's, tropical coconut stuff, or it's soya, or it's a whole host of things that you find that some of the people that eat the least locally, that are the most environmentally minded, are the ones are the vegetarians, and they're getting their stuff from all over the place. Whereas there are plenty of really good reasons to be a vegetarian when you don't have access to good meat, when you or you just can't afford it. However, here we live in an area where water is abundant, pasture is abundant, and there is a lot of great local food and meat that is relatively affordable. And in choosing not to participate in the system, is you have to go far out. And sure, certainly, this globalized world is much smaller than it used to be, and we will always be participating in eating or buying or participating in systems far from here, and that's just part of the nature of what's our world shrinking, and that's fine. But if we could, at least in our eating habits, if we could get a significant portion of our consumption to be local, and when you have the option here of a food that is so nutrient dense, a food that is finely tuned to what we need for our brains, for our hearts, for our vascular systems, and on so many levels, and it's complete with all the amino acids that you need, and you don't have to go halfway around the world to get this special plant that's got what you need. It's right here available. It seems to me a shame that you would exclude that, or even go farther and vilify that. There's also a very strong argument that makes the case that, especially for like heritage breed or animals that we're afraid of losing the genetics, if we simply by plugging into the man's economic system, there's the saying, if you don't eat them, we'll lose them. And it's very real thing that if a farmer can't raise and make money and sell for people to eat, there's really these genetics and these species are going to die out. But I want to push beyond just things that we're missing out on, because I think there's a darker side, an even more dangerous side effect that can happen when we refuse to eat and participate in the systems that are all around us. And I think that this basically is what gets back to the schizophrenia that I opened up with, and Michael Pollan say that we are a very strange creature, that we have to figure out what our relationship to nature is, whether we are romantic towards it, or whether we're stewards of it, or whether we're going to get paid back by it. But we have this strange sort of stance towards something that we are really, truly, really a part of, and we are embedded in a system just as everything else is. And what happens when you some of the worst things that might happen when you have the schizophrenic stance is that the hubris starts to creep in. And I think that there's we can see this all around, like from the way that nature is being abused, the way that we strip mine, the way we mountaintop removal, the way we pollute waters, the way we have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, where fish can't even have enough oxygen, where the way we have eighth continent of plastic, and we're just if we're schizophrenic and we have a stance towards nature, we can just kind of chalk this up as, oh man, we need to do a better job, and we need to really, we need to get motivated to do something, because it might have this effect on us, sort of vaguely indirect, versus if we realized that we are just one system among many just interacting, then we realize that to destroy nature is actually an act of suicide, and that we are destroying our health as a species, our health as individuals, and it's an act of self-annihilation. And it has a very different tone. And to have this hubris that we have suddenly evolved into the sentient being that no longer eats meat is to say, oh, we know better than nature. The nature which became as amazing and abundant as it is by the principle and the currency of eating. As an example of this type of thinking, I want to reference a documentary came out a few years ago called Cowspiracy by a guy, Kip Anderson, I think. And I really run the risk of saying, trying to argue against a straw man, because it was really poorly done, and many people have gone through and debunked, a lot of his thinking. I mean, a lot of his sort of mathematical computations, and he just skipped over a ton. He also really did a very poor, well, not a poor, very unethical kind of journalism, where anytime you talking or interviewing somebody you disagree with, in the background you put these pictures of animals suffering or killing, and this very emotional manipulation and exploitation, really. And so I run the risk of it being a straw man, but I bother to talk about it because I think enough people really follow this train of thought so that even if his facts don't really add up, still very many people follow that train of thought. And that's what I want to critique, is that train of thought. Because he starts out with a very very good and very real critique of, cows and feedlots. And you have these ruminants on this, totally bare area. They're probably usually outside, but they're this complete bare area, where the pasture has long been way overgrazed and is completely just obliviated. And they're bringing in water, they bringing in, all the grain, and just the net energy impact here is just utterly negative. And just can be considered an environmental atrocity. and the very, very real critique of that. And originally, when I heard about it, I was very excited that someone was bringing to light some of what's going on. But it becomes very clear as you go on that this guy was just uncomfortable with killing or eating an animal, and so he makes this sort of real quick reference to, a pasture, and for them it's just a mathematical computation of sort of a sum zero or net, energy, carbon imprint or footprint, whatnot, and no remotely even consideration of what it means to have an animal in her proper niche in the ecosystem and, interrelating with the system. So, she has no concept of how beautiful a cow is when she is in her right place. So, stick her on a perennial pasture, and here we have the solar panel that is, converting the sun's energy like nothing we've been able to do, and it's converting it into, grass and plants, but of course that is unavailable. We can't access that kind of energy. So then you have this beautiful animal that has evolved and found its niche, and it can take that, grass, take the pasture and convert it to, first converts it to meat for its, to provide you with meat, or it can provide you with extremely nutritious milk, all while ameliorating the soil from the manure that gets put back in. And there's thousands or millions of species of bacteria of animals that live within her rumen, that are essential to the systems and the health of ecosystems. And so this, a cow can be in the system and not only feed you with extraordinary nutrition that is perfectly, synchronized with our systems, but then she leaves the pasture better than when she came, and something beautiful in that system gets thrown out because they have no concept of this interrelatedness. And rather than seeing the beauty of a system like that's been developed in nature very efficiently over the millennium, they see this answer in, meat could possibly be ethical if we grow it in a petri dish, which on so many levels is absolutely absurd. Even from their point of view, I just can't imagine that could ever be, a net positive energy to make that in a petri dish. But even if, in this nets, the zero-sum game of energy, if you made it, and even if you made it palatable where you could eat it, you're no longer participating in the systems of ecology and the nature around you. You've completely divorced yourself, and now you've tied yourself to this really mechanistic, industrial sort of world of growing this technologically without it being connected. Or if it's connected, it's all connected to oil, or it's connected to extraction, or it's connected to machinery and technology, which has its place. But essentially, that's not really, the foundation of who we are. And so that is supposedly the answer to meat. Whereas here we have these beautiful synergistic systems that not only provide us with the nutrition that's finely tuned to who we are, we've evolved along with them, but they leave the land better than when they came. And this is lost. And so it saddens me that we have so many people who are sort of stuck in this mind frame of what it is to be environmentally aware. Because these, it's one thing to be criticizing the extraction model and whatnot, but these people like Kip, who's doing this documentary, are sort of claimed to be the champions of, to save the environment. That was the claim, is these cows are hurting the environment. But they're so divorced from reality. They're so disconnected because they do not eat and they do not have the currency of nature. So they do not, they're not participating. And so these champions of the environment want to get rid of a cow, which is one of, the ruminants are one of the driving species that can convert solar energy and drive the system. And I just find it a shame that in the hubris of thinking that we know better than nature, even when we claim that we're, championing her and trying to be, conservationists and whatnot, we do great harm. So if you'll allow me to push this economic metaphor just a little bit farther as eating as currency, we think of investment and we think of that, I don't have much capital, so I can't really invest and whatnot. But if suddenly you think of eating as currency, then we all have capital. And we all have a capital that we're going to be spending or investing one way or another. And this is a matter of choice. So it's something that's going to be done no matter what. And it's just a matter of how much you're going to be conscious about it and how much, obviously, issues of whether you can afford it and availability and whatnot are going to play a part in this. But every day we choose, and every day we have no choice but to be investing in one system or another and participate in it. And so I would argue and encourage people to as often as they can within their means to participate by eating and whatever systems that they find that are local, are healthy, or from farms and farmers that are doing very responsible and ethical and ecologically minded jobs, that these are the systems that they need to participate in. This would be one way that'll trump pretty much any other way of being the environmentalist, of caring about the environment, because this is something that is done every day. This is sort of a quotidian investment that you can make a little tiny difference every day, which is so much more valuable in my mind than going on a campaign or signing a petition, that you get all excited about for a week and then you forget about. But this is something that we can develop habitual, regular ways of changing the world, that we do what we can. All right. Well, thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time.